You are listening to another podcast series by the Sacred Art of Living community, honoring soul-sized questions.
In our culture, talking about a good death seems like an oxymoron. Like, what could possibly be good about dying? Kevin Dieter has spent much of his life working in hospice where that question cannot be sidestepped. Dr. Dieter's experiences and real-life stories are compelling and inspiring. In this podcast series, we look forward to 4 intimate and powerful conversations about something that every one of us will eventually have to deal with. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Soul-Sized Questions. Today, we're coming to you all together from the studio in Sacred Art of Living Center in Bend, Oregon. In this new series of episodes, we begin exploring this question: what is a good death? Joining us in the discussion is Richard Groves, founder and director of the Sacred Art of Living Center, and Kevin Dieter, a doctor, a hospice physician with 35 years of experience, who is focused on educating medical students about end-of-life care. Both Richard and Kevin are also presenters in the Center's Art of Living and Dying program. So Kevin, let's start with you. How did you get into palliative care and hospice work?
Sure. I think it's a good place to start. So it's been a very interesting journey. About 35 years ago, a patient asked me this question. She said, I'm ready to die. Can you help me? So at that time, I was totally unprepared for that question. And as it turns out, working with that individual, I now refer to her as my most profound teacher. So I was a fledgling young family physician starting my new practice. And when that question was asked to me, with having 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency training, nothing to that point prepared me on how to answer that or how to address her concern. As a matter of fact, the underlying curriculum through medical school was that death was the enemy. So that it was never an option to help someone accept their own death. We were trying to prevent death. And if we couldn't remember that, we were reminded in our training by every time a patient died, we would have morbidity and mortality conferences where we would sit down with all the other physicians and answer questions about why did that death occur, with the probing questions being, what could you have done differently? What didn't you do? What consult didn't you get? So that was the theme of my training as a physician. And on top of that, the culture wasn't ready for that question either. We live in the most death-denying culture that's ever existed. So there was not community and cultural and societal support for someone saying, you know what, I'm tired and I'm ready for the end to come. Yeah. So she was a 93-year-old woman who really had a wonderful, full life, but for the last several years developed end-stage heart disease. Her heart was failing, her lungs were failing, and in order to remain comfortable at home, she had to take a bunch of medications. She had outlived all of her relatives, with the exception of one niece, who was the one that brought her back and forth to the doctor visits, and she had outlived all of her friends. So she came to me with that question and said, told me all of those facts, and said, I'm not suicidal, and I'm going to do this one way or another. And either I'm going to go back home and stop taking my medications, or I'm coming to you to see if you could help me somehow be comfortable. So this was not a one-and-done conversation. This was a series of conversations over several weeks, always with her niece in the room, and always with me in between trying to figure out what is the best approach here, summoning not only my medical training, but my spiritual training and ethical and moral, and all of those issues were part of that.
How old were you at the time?
Oh, I was in my early to mid-30s, yeah. And so that was when the teaching from her began with that first question. So we finally came to the conclusion that the best thing to do, that what I could offer her, was to admit her to the hospital and withdraw her medications. And they're in a monitored situation where we have medical personnel there to work to keep her comfortable, that we could let her natural death play out. So that's what I did. I admitted her to the hospital, and once again, I talk about her as being, over the next 12 days, my most profound teacher. And so what happened was I would make rounds every morning on her. And every day, she would teach me something about how to approach death with grace and dignity and courage. I learned that entering her room was entering sacred space. I realized that she was more in control of what happened in that room than I was or anybody else medically. And that she also taught me that not all suffering can be eliminated, that I had to learn to be able to sit next to her in that room and realize that she was suffering and I couldn't fix it. Now, I could use my medications to mitigate some of her physical symptoms, but I realized there was something else going on there. And so in that whole process, I questioned myself a lot. Said, what am I missing? Does she need a consultation with somebody else? What am I not doing? And I realized after she died that in that whole process, the other thing that she was teaching me was to learn about myself and to realize, as I've learned subsequently, that just showing up as my perfectly imperfect human self at her bedside every day and not running away was probably one of the most powerful tools and medicines that I had. So that was the start of this journey that I never would have predicted when I entered medical school. I didn't know that this door would open. And every patient that I've cared for since that time has added to that learning and that education.
That's a remarkable story, Kevin, and it's a great illustration of one of the main teachings of this course that you and I have been involved with, The Art of Living and Dying, where we say that the dying are our teachers. And I think that's a really confounding statement for a lot of people at first, because I think, especially when we're in the helping professions, our job is to do for them whatever we can to alleviate the suffering. And to imagine that they are the medicine in some ways for us in that situation is quite a turnaround, isn't it?
It is. It really truly is. So, as you mentioned, I do a lot of teaching of medical students and other folks too, but I'm really focused on the medical student group because I've realized that so many medical students graduate from training and they've never been with a patient who's dying naturally.
Yeah.
Most of their deaths have been at the end of CPR that failed, or withdrawal of life support in the ICU, or in the ER after some type of trauma. But they just don't have the opportunity to sit with and be with a person who's at the end of life. And it's a whole different mindset, because as physicians, when we enter the patient's room and we're trying to fix a problem that we can fix, we have our agenda and we know what we want to do and we know what the options are. And when you're with someone at the end of life, it's their agenda that kind of drives how long this is going to take and how it's going to go. And so we have to be able to change our mindset to be comfortable with not knowing, with realizing that so much that happens in that room that I call entering sacred space is a mystery. We just cannot and don't understand everything that's happening. And to just be okay with that. And that's where the teaching comes in.
Yeah.
So the teaching comes in, I would say, earlier than the active dying process, when folks at the end of life start to share with us what they think are important lessons from their life. So there can be a verbal, almost like a mentor-student relationship with the patient teaching the medical student about life lessons. It could be nonverbal. It could be the way that they make medical decisions at the end of their life to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. And so that's when the elements of grace and courage and dignity come in. You just see ways that people approach dying. And by no means are all of those choices things that we, as humans, and it's the end of our life, might choose. It's the choice of every one of us to do it the way they want to do, in their own time and in their own way. But we start to learn that. We start to learn what the options are. And I think when it plays out the way that it can, particularly for medical students, learning from these folks, it emboldens them. In what I've heard time and time again, in opportunities where we put medical students in situations to learn from dying folks, is that it's the most impactful experience they've had in medical school, and that it's life-changing. Even for these young medical students, they walk away saying, this is going to change how I look, not only about trying to imagine I'm in the deathbed, but more importantly, how am I going to live my life? What decisions do I have to make as I'm living? How do I prioritize things so when it's my turn, that it's going to go as well as it can?
Yeah. And, there's so many things coming up in my head, I'm sure for you too, but one of the things, since the question is what is a good death, you said in that early introduction, the story about that there was suffering going on, but it wasn't suffering you could treat. So can you talk about what you experience in trying to be with that suffering, but also what is it that makes a good or a bad death along those lines?
Yeah. So my understanding of that distinction between a good and a bad death has changed. I used to teach good versus bad death. And I would start with asking the students to imagine their own death. And to, if they could wave a magic wand and imagine they're on their deathbed, what are the things that they would want or not want? What are the qualities of that experience? And there's this uniform list that people, medical student or not, generate about how they imagine their death, how they want it to go. So it's typical things like being at home or a home-like setting, not the hospital, being surrounded by family and friends, to be out of physical pain, to have a sense of legacy, to feel like your life has been meaningful. There's these common things. And then, so we would focus on that and say, well, that would be a good death. And then anything that fell short of that was a bad death. And so what I started to realize is those are pejorative terms. Those are judgmental terms. Because what I learned was there are so many factors in the dying process that are out of anybody's control. For instance, I may look at a certain patient and say, here's how I think this should go for you to have the best death. But because of family issues, because of psychospiritual issues, because of financial issues, none of those things can happen. So does that make that a bad death?
Yeah.
So what I started to do was kind of a middle of the road and get away from the dualism and come up with a term that I just refer to, the best death possible. So for every individual, that our hope is that we could give them the opportunity to have the best death possible given their circumstances. So
that's brilliant, of course. And you started off by talking about being trained 35 years ago with the cultural attitude that death is the enemy, and especially in medical school for the doctor. And I think what we often forget is in some ways physicians were put in that category by demand from society. Society demanded that the doctor be the one who can delay death, fix everything. And I'm just wondering how in this 35 years, that's a long time that we've been involved in this work. You mentioned that society and culture wasn't ready for this new change. Have you noticed a shift in the last generation?
For society or for the medical community?
I guess they're both kind of related to each other is what I'm suggesting.
Yeah. So there has been a shift. There has been subtle areas of acceptance of death and dying to the point where we want to control it. So that's where we have the emergence of medical aid in dying and those type of things, which appeal to a certain segment of the population. And it really is a control issue. It's I want to be able to choose the timing and the manner of my death. And so they're facing it kind of head on, but they're also kind of sacrificing a lot of the uncertainty or the unknown in doing that. But in general, I would say that our culture has not come a long way. They're more open to talking about it, and we have made some advances, for instance, advance directives, where folks are being asked now to, ahead of time, make medical decisions about how they want their medical care to go as they get sicker, particularly when they get to a point where the medical issues cannot be reversed. And so folks have gradually bought into that, but where that falls short and where society still struggles, and where I think we as physicians in the medical community have a huge role, is to make people imagine their own death. Because even when we do advance directives, it's this imaginary, vague, when it comes time for you to die, do you want to be on the ventilator? Do you want IV hydration?
Right.
Do you want antibiotics? And that's all, when you're being asked those questions and fill out those forms, they're very helpful because it helps give guidance to your loved ones who may have to make those decisions for you. Right. It gives you a chance to say something. But I don't think we prepare people for the actual dying process. And I refer to it as facing the abyss. And one of the metaphors I use is Indiana Jones. So in Indiana Jones movies, he's running through the forest and the arrows are flying. He trips over a stump, rolls down a hill, and you think, there's this suspense that this is it. And then he comes to a clearing and his eyes open and he says, "Oh, good, I made it to the clearing." And then he takes a few more steps and there's a 10,000-foot abyss. Right. And so I use that as a metaphor for dying, because a lot of folks, our culture thinks, well, if I do the advance directive, then I've got it made. I don't have to think about it anymore. But they don't think about the dying process. And so they get there, they make all the decisions to have the kind of medical care at the end of life that they want, and then it's time to die, and nobody's prepared them for that. So what does that mean? Well, they haven't thought about legacy issues. They haven't thought about approaching their spiritual pain and suffering. They haven't talked about taking care of their family. They haven't talked about their wishes to their family. And so all of a sudden, it's a crisis, and all these decisions have to be made. And in my experience, that's where a lot of the regrets of the dying come from, is that they don't feel like they had enough time to prepare for this time that needs preparation. Again, we don't have total control, but we've got control over enough things that I've witnessed enough people dying and having, a blessed or a happy death in the best death possible.
Well, I think we're going to have a ton to unpack here. I'm sure you think the same thing. And I hope that all of you are having the same experience I'm having of just a deep meaning and introspection for ourselves. And so I encourage all of you to stay tuned for the next episode of Soul-Sized Questions, when we continue our discussion of what is a good death. We hope you will continue to follow our conversations with Dr. Kevin Dieter on the soul-sized questions surrounding the end of life. For more information about courses on the art of living and dying, check out our website at sacredartofliving.org.